My name is Isabella Harrington. I am 28 years old, and last year my father looked me in the eye across our family's mahogany dining table and said the words no daughter ever expects to hear. You are no longer part of this family. That moment changed everything I thought I knew about love, loyalty, and blood. Sit back, relax, and stay with me until the very end of this story. If you want more stories like this one, don't forget to like this video, leave a comment about what you think so far, and subscribe so you never miss the next chapter. I was born into one of Manhattan's most powerful families. The Harringtons are synonymous with glass towers and billion-dollar deals. People hear my last name and immediately think of luxury, prestige, and untouchable privilege. What they don't know is how suffocating it feels to grow up in a world where appearances matter more than truth, where every move is scripted, and where stepping outside the family plan is seen as betrayal. My father, Richard Harrington, built our family's fortune in real estate, transforming blocks of New York into glittering developments. To the outside world, he is a visionary businessman. To me, he is a man who measures worth by profit margins and obedience. My mother, Victoria, was born into money herself. She doesn't build things the way my father does, but she manages something just as valuable in their world, our image. Her friends call her elegant, refined, impeccable. I know her as a woman who can cut deeper with one disapproving glance than my father ever could with words. I am the middle child, trapped between the golden boy and the acceptable rebel. My older brother Edward was always the chosen one. He was groomed to inherit Harrington real estate from the day he could shake a hand at a cocktail party. Every achievement of his was celebrated, every failure smoothed over. My younger sister Clara was given more freedom, but even her rebellions were carefully curated. She studied art history instead of business, went to Yale instead of Harvard, but still dated the right kind of man and attended the right galas. She was different, but in ways that kept the family image intact. Then there was me. I didn't just want to live a slightly different life. I wanted to ask the questions no one in my family dared to ask. Why did we have so much, while others had so little? Why did we donate to charities for photo opportunities, then mock the very people those charities claimed to help? Why did my parents care more about magazine spreads than meaningful conversations at our own dinner table? At 16, while Edward was sailing in the Hamptons and Clara was shopping on Fifth Avenue, I spent a summer volunteering at a legal aid clinic in Brooklyn. I watched attorneys fight for families who had nothing and yet refused to give up. I felt something inside me ignite. For the first time in my life, I saw a path that meant more than status, more than reputation. I saw a way to live with purpose. Of course, in the Harrington household, purpose that didn't bring prestige was dangerous. My choice to pursue law, instead of business, became the first fracture in our carefully constructed family portrait. My father slammed his fist on the dining table more times than I can count, his face turning crimson as he demanded to know why I was wasting my potential. My mother's response was quieter but no less brutal. She would sigh, touch the pearls at her neck, and murmur that I was a disappointment. They paid for my education at Harvard, but their support was poisoned with expectation. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, if I graduated with honors, if I passed the bar exam, maybe they would finally see me as something more than the disappointment who refused to obey. But deep down, I knew the truth. My family didn't want me to succeed. They wanted me to comply. Have you ever felt like nothing you did would ever be enough for the people you loved most? The night of my brother's engagement dinner, when I walked into our glittering Fifth Avenue penthouse, I thought maybe things would finally change. I could never have guessed that by dessert, my life would be turned upside down forever. The morning I learned I had passed the New York State bar exam was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. After years of studying late into the night, living off caffeine and stubbornness, sacrificing weekends while my friends enjoyed freedom, I had finally done it. My name was there on the official list, a black and white confirmation that I was, in fact, good enough. I sat frozen in my small Cambridge apartment, staring at the screen until the letters blurred. For a fleeting moment, I let myself feel something I rarely felt in connection to my family: hope. Maybe this would be the moment they stopped seeing me as a disappointment. Maybe this would be the accomplishment that finally made me worthy. I picked up the phone before my doubt could drown out the excitement. My mother answered on the third ring, her voice as cool and precise as ever, as though she had just stepped out of one of her curated luncheons. I told her the news, my voice trembling with pride and fear. There was a pause, then a sigh so soft yet so sharp it cut through me. She congratulated me in a tone that felt rehearsed, then quickly shifted the conversation. I asked if she would include the achievement in the Harrington newsletter she distributed to our social circle 4 times a year. That newsletter was more than a glossy update. It was our family's trophy case, mailed out to senators, philanthropists, and old money friends from Newport to Palm Beach. For years I had seen Edward's promotions and Clara's curated art exhibits featured on its pages. I thought, just this once, my name might be worthy too. Isabella, she said, her voice carrying that familiar undertone of disappointment. Thousands of people pass the bar every year. It's hardly something people will find remarkable. Now, Edward's engagement to Samantha Pierce, that is news. That deserves to be celebrated. The words landed like a blow. In one instant, my joy drained away, replaced by the old familiar ache of not being enough. I managed a polite response, but inside I felt myself collapsing. My mother wasn't cruel in the way my father could be. Her cruelty was quieter, more elegant, but it was no less devastating. To her, my success was ordinary. To her, Edward's engagement was extraordinary. Samantha Pierce. Her name carried weight in New York and Southampton society alike. Her father owned one of the largest shipping companies on the East Coast. Their family had money older than ours and connections deeper than Wall Street. Samantha had gone to the right schools, mingled with the right people, and fit seamlessly into the role my parents valued most, the perfect extension of our brand. Her marriage to Edward was not just a union of 2 people. It was a merger of power, wealth, and influence. I hung up the phone and sat in silence, staring out my window at the gray winter sky. My hands trembled. I had just accomplished something that had consumed my life for years, and yet in my mother's eyes, it wasn't worth even a footnote. I realized, with a cold twist in my stomach, that the dinner celebrating Edward and Samantha's engagement was never going to be about family. It was going to be a coronation. A display of what happens when you follow the plan. And by contrast, it would be the perfect stage for my own quiet humiliation. That night, I replayed the conversation again and again. I thought about calling my father, but I knew how that would go. He would tell me to stop being dramatic, remind me that the only law worth practicing was corporate law, preferably within Harrington real estate. I thought about calling Clara, but I knew she would only murmur sympathy while keeping her distance. My siblings had long since learned that siding with me came with consequences. So I sat alone in the quiet, my pride crumbling into dust, my hope shrinking into something small and fragile. Days passed, and preparations for Edward's engagement dinner filled the Harrington household. I heard about it through whispered updates from family acquaintances and social media posts from Samantha's circle. The dinner would be held at our Fifth Avenue penthouse, overlooking Central Park, with a guest list handpicked from New York's elite. It wasn't just a family dinner. It was a performance, and everyone attending knew their role. Everyone but me. When the invitation arrived, it was written in my mother's elegant script, as though nothing had happened. As though her dismissal of my accomplishment had been a minor detail, forgotten as quickly as it was spoken. I stared at the heavy cardstock, at the calligraphy announcing Edward and Samantha's official celebration, and felt the tension coil inside me like a spring. The Harringtons always knew how to put on a show, but what they didn't know was that I had news of my own. I had accepted a position with the Legal Aid Society of New York. It was not prestigious by my family's standards. It did not come with 6-figure salaries or cocktail party bragging rights. But it was meaningful. It was the reason I had pursued law in the first place. It was the first step toward becoming the kind of lawyer who stood up for people who had no one else to fight for them. And as terrified as I was, part of me wanted to say it out loud at that dinner, to carve out a sliver of space at that table for my truth, even if it was met with silence or scorn. In the days leading up to the dinner, I prepared carefully. I chose a dress my mother had once praised, hoping it might soften her judgment. I rehearsed what I would say about my job, trying to find the right balance between pride and defiance. My heart knew it would be a battle. My head told me to stay quiet, but something in me refused to shrink any longer. The night of the dinner arrived, heavy with expectation. As I stood in front of the mirror, fastening my grandmother Margaret's pearl earrings, I touched them lightly, imagining her warm smile. She had been the only one in our family who looked at me and saw not a liability, not a disappointment, but a person worth believing in. I wondered what she would say if she were alive to see me now. Perhaps she would tell me to hold my head high, to speak the truth even if my voice shook. I took one last deep breath and stepped out into the cold Manhattan evening. The lights of the city glittered around me, dazzling and indifferent. Somewhere high above Fifth Avenue, my family was gathering, glasses of champagne in hand, ready to celebrate Edward and Samantha. I was walking into their world again, but this time I carried something they didn't expect. As the car pulled up to the familiar building, I felt the tension rise inside me. I knew that once I stepped through those doors, the stage would be set for a confrontation I could no longer avoid. What I didn't know was how quickly that confrontation would spiral out of control. And so, as I approached the penthouse that night, I told myself this would either be the beginning of reconciliation or the end of everything I thought family was supposed to mean. I had no idea that by dessert, my entire life would be rewritten. The night of my brother's engagement dinner is etched into my memory as vividly as a scar. The Fifth Avenue penthouse had never looked more like a stage set, every detail rehearsed, polished, and perfected. The chandeliers glowed with golden light that spilled across the mahogany table, polished so brightly it reflected the stemware like a mirror. The air smelled faintly of roses and roasted duck, expensive fragrances designed to impress the guests who mattered. For as long as I had lived there, our dining room had never been about family. It had always been about performance. That night, it became the theater for my exile. I was the last to arrive, not because I was late, but because I dreaded walking into a room where I knew my presence was tolerated rather than wanted. My father was already at the head of the table, his watch glinting under the lights, his posture as rigid as the rules he enforced. My mother moved like a queen in her silk gown, every gesture precise, every word chosen for its ability to impress. Edward stood tall by the fireplace, Samantha at his side, a vision of carefully curated perfection. Her blonde hair gleamed, her designer gown seemed untouched by the world, and her smile was so well rehearsed it looked permanent. She radiated everything my parents valued. Beside them, Clara slouched in her chair, her eyes glued to her phone, pretending to be uninterested but missing nothing. I had chosen my outfit with care, a navy dress my mother had once complimented, paired with the pearl earrings my grandmother left me. Those pearls had always been my secret shield, a reminder that at least one family member had loved me unconditionally. As I stepped into the room, I touched them briefly, hoping they would give me courage. My mother crossed the room to kiss my cheeks lightly, whispering as her lips brushed my skin, "You could have done more with your hair." The words stung, but I forced a smile, as I always did. We were seated in our assigned positions, the arrangement as strict as everything else in the Harrington household. My father at the head, my mother at the opposite end, Edward and Samantha to one side, Clara and me on the other. The first course arrived in silence, lobster bisque steaming in delicate porcelain bowls. My mother broke the quiet by prompting Edward to recount the details of his proposal. He obliged with a gleam in his eye, telling of the private yacht anchored off the coast of Capri, the violinist flown in from Vienna, the Michelin-starred chef preparing dinner on the deck under the stars. Samantha leaned against him, glowing under the weight of the story, every detail designed to display opulence. The table filled with the sound of admiration, the kind my family reserved for grand gestures of wealth and status. I sipped my soup in silence, watching my father watch me. His eyes held that calculating look, waiting for me to ruin the moment, to say something that would betray my difference. He wanted me to misstep, to give him an excuse. I didn't. I smiled politely and said, "That sounds lovely. I'm happy for you both." A flicker of disappointment crossed his face. The main course arrived, duck breast with cherry reduction, as flawless as every detail of the night. Conversation turned to wedding plans, the inevitable blending of the Harrington and Pierce dynasties, the expansion of power and wealth this marriage represented. I felt the weight of my own news pressing against me, the secret I had carried in silence since the day I passed the bar. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a sip of wine and waited for the right moment. When a lull finally came, I cleared my throat. "I have something to share," I said softly, my voice cutting through the hum of conversation. All eyes turned toward me. My palms were damp against the linen napkin in my lap. "I passed the bar exam, and I've accepted a position with the Legal Aid Society of New York. I wanted to thank you both for supporting my education, even though I know it wasn't the path you would have chosen for me." For a moment, silence blanketed the room. My mother's hand trembled slightly as she raised her glass to her lips. My father cut into his duck with slow precision, the blade of his knife scraping against porcelain. Edward stared at his plate. Samantha avoided my gaze, and Clara watched me with wide eyes, almost fascinated by the unfolding scene. My father set down his knife and fork with deliberate finality. His voice was measured, but the fury beneath it was unmistakable. "Passing an exam is hardly an achievement worth mentioning at the same dinner where we are celebrating your brother's engagement. But since you've brought it up, have you reconsidered my offer to join the Harrington legal department?" I drew in a deep breath, my pulse hammering in my throat. "Actually, no. I believe in this work. The Legal Aid Society helps people who have nowhere else to turn. It is why I became a lawyer." My father leaned back in his chair, his expression cold, his eyes narrowing. "The Legal Aid Society, that little charity operation you volunteered at in high school? Isabella, this is an embarrassment. Do you have any idea what it looks like when people ask me what my daughter does, and I have to tell them she's chosen to waste her education on criminals and welfare cases?" I swallowed hard. My voice shook, but I forced myself to speak. "They're not criminals, they're families, they're citizens who deserve representation. It's meaningful work." My mother's voice slid in, soft, but lethal. "We've tolerated your phase of rebellion, Isabella. We paid for your education at the finest institutions in the world, and this is how you repay us? By throwing it all away?" The air in the room grew heavier. My father's face flushed deep crimson, the vein at his temple throbbing. He rose from his chair, his napkin falling to the floor. His voice thundered, each word sharp as glass. "If you insist on this path, then you are no longer welcome here. You are not my daughter, you are not part of this family. Do not come back." The room fell silent, stunned into stillness. My mother did not contradict him. Edward stared harder at his plate. Samantha shifted uncomfortably. Clara's eyes flicked to mine, wide with shock but muted by fear. My father turned to Wilson, the butler who had known me since I was a child, who once snuck me cookies when I was punished. "Wilson, escort her out. Her apartment keys are on the hall table. Make sure she takes them. Effective immediately, her financial access is revoked." Wilson looked at me, his expression pained, but he nodded. "This way, Miss Isabella." His voice cracked with the weight of betrayal he was forced to carry out. I rose slowly, my legs trembling, my chest burning with humiliation. Behind me, the dinner continued as though nothing had happened, as though I had never existed. Wilson handed me my coat in the foyer and a small envelope containing my keys. He leaned close, whispering, "I'm sorry, miss, this isn't right." The heavy front door shut behind me with a final click. The lock turned. I stood on the granite steps of the building, the Manhattan night buzzing around me, my grandmother's pearls cold against my skin. The life I had known had ended in the span of a single dinner. And as I walked into the dark city streets, clutching my useless keys, I realized the true cost of choosing my own path was only beginning to reveal itself. The ride back to my apartment that night felt like a dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. The cab's interior smelled faintly of cigarette smoke, the driver humming to a song on the radio that I could barely hear over the roar in my ears. I kept touching my pearl earrings as if they could anchor me, as if their weight could remind me that I was still real. By the time the taxi pulled up to my building in Cambridge, the numbness was starting to give way to a sickening panic. I had lived in that apartment for 3 years. A sleek, two-bedroom space, with floor-to-ceiling windows, and a doorman who greeted me with professional politeness every evening. My parents had insisted on it, of course. They called it a necessity for my safety, but I understood it for what it was. Another leash. Another way to remind me that even my independence was borrowed from their wealth. That night, stepping into the marble lobby, I realized just how fragile that illusion of independence had been. When I reached my door, I tried to unlock it, but my key stuck. My hands shook as I twisted it again and again, finally forcing it open. Inside, the apartment looked the same, but it felt different, almost hostile. The silence was heavy. My phone buzzed in my hand. It was Clara. "Are you okay?" she whispered. I could hear the tension in her voice, as though she had ducked into a hallway to make the call. "What do you think?" I said bitterly. "I can't believe he did that," she said quickly. "Father had Wilson change the locks already. Even the gate code." I closed my eyes. "Did you or Edward say anything after I left?" There was a pause. "Edward said you brought it on yourself." Samantha looked uncomfortable but didn't speak up. "I tried to defend you, but Father, he threatened me too. He said if I kept pushing, he'd do the same to me." Her words landed heavily. Edward had always been Father's perfect soldier, and Clara, for all her subtle rebellion, was still tethered to the family's money. I couldn't expect them to risk their security for me. "It doesn't matter," I whispered, even though it did. "I'll figure something out." After we hung up, I opened my laptop to check my bank accounts. My checking account, which had held nearly $5,000 that morning, was now zero. My savings, about $15,000 left from living stipends, was also gone. My credit cards were declined when I tried to order delivery food. The app flashing payment failed like a cruel joke. It hadn't even been 24 hours, and I was already stranded. I stayed awake most of the night, pacing through the apartment, staring at the designer furniture my parents had helped me choose. It all looked so meaningless now. The irony was sharp. I was surrounded by luxury, and yet I couldn't afford groceries. Morning came, and with it, a sharp knock on the door. It was my landlord. He carried an envelope and a stiff smile. "Your father called me," he said bluntly. "He's no longer guaranteeing your lease. Without a guarantor, you have 30 days to either find someone else or vacate." My stomach dropped. 30 days to rebuild my life from nothing. By noon, I had already called half a dozen friends. Some offered sympathy, none could offer help. The only person who did was Jasmine, a law school classmate who came from a middle-class family. She had worked part-time jobs during school, lived in cramped apartments, and knew what it meant to struggle. When I explained my situation, her response was simple. "Come stay with me until you figure things out. I have a couch." I swallowed my pride and accepted. That evening, I began dismantling my old life. I took pictures of my furniture and posted them on resale sites. The Eames chair my father had insisted was a good investment piece went for a fraction of its value. The glass dining table, the art prints, the Persian rug, each item sold quickly to strangers who didn't care about the name tags attached. With every pickup, I felt a piece of my former life stripped away. The hardest moment came when I stood in front of my jewelry box, staring at my grandmother Margaret's pearl necklace. The matching piece to the earrings I still wore. It was one of the only tangible connections I had left to her. But sentiment didn't pay bills. The next morning, I walked into a pawn shop in Brooklyn, clutching the necklace in my hand. The owner examined it under a magnifying glass, then offered me $900. I knew it was worth at least 10 times that, but desperation left me no choice. When he handed me a receipt, he said softly, "You have 90 days to buy it back." I nodded, my throat tight, and walked out with the cash stuffed into my coat pocket. Moving into Jasmine's apartment in Queens was like stepping into another world. The space was small, crowded with mismatched furniture, but it pulsed with a kind of warmth I had never known in my pristine penthouse or sleek Cambridge apartment. Jasmine and her roommate cooked together, laughed easily, and welcomed me without hesitation. I unfolded the couch at night, trying to ignore the tears that slipped down my cheeks in the dark. The pain of rejection gnawed at me constantly, but so did something else. A flicker of resilience. For the first time, I wasn't just surviving under my parents' shadow. I was learning how to live without them. Still, the transition was brutal. Grocery shopping was a lesson in humility. I found myself reaching for store brands, comparing prices, calculating meals down to the last cent. I discovered the public library offered free internet, saving me from spending money at coffee shops while applying for temporary jobs. I even learned which bakeries handed out leftovers at closing. Each day became a test, each small victory a reminder that I could adapt. One night, sitting on Jasmine's couch with a pile of legal documents for my temp review job, I felt the full weight of what I had lost. My family, my safety net, my identity as a Harrington. But beneath the grief was something else, something terrifying and exhilarating all at once. Freedom. It was not the life I had imagined when I walked into that engagement dinner, pearls at my ears and hope in my chest. It was raw, it was uncertain, and it was mine. And just when I thought I was beginning to adjust to this new reality, something happened that shifted everything again. It came in the form of an email, marked urgent, from the last person I expected to hear from, my family's attorney. The email appeared in my inbox on a gray Tuesday morning, buried between job alerts and reminders from my temporary document review assignment. The subject line stopped me cold. Urgent. Please call immediately. The sender was Charles Whitman, my family's longtime attorney. For a moment I thought it had to be a mistake. Charles was my father's man, always immaculately dressed, always at his side at board meetings and charity galas. He had known me since childhood, but never once had he reached out to me directly. My heart pounded as I read his brief message. Miss Harrington, a matter of extreme urgency has come to my attention regarding your financial situation. Please contact me at your earliest convenience to discuss. This is time-sensitive and impacts you directly. I stared at the screen, torn between curiosity and suspicion. My father had made it very clear I was no longer part of the family. Why would their lawyer suddenly be contacting me? Jasmine leaned over my shoulder, her brow furrowed. Sounds fishy. What if it's some trap? She asked. I shook my head. Charles has always been formal, professional. If he's reaching out, something must be wrong. Still, my hands trembled as I picked up the phone. When I called, the receptionist at Whitman & Associates answered in her usual polished tone, then transferred me. After a long pause, Charles's voice came on the line. Isabella, thank you for calling. I was worried you might ignore my message. Why would I answer? I snapped. You represent my father, the man who cut me off and made sure I had nothing. What could you possibly want with me now? He cleared his throat. This is not about your father, it's about your grandmother, Margaret's trust. At the mention of my grandmother, my breath caught. Margaret had been the only person in the family who ever saw me for who I was. She used to take me for tea in Central Park, listening patiently as I rambled about books and dreams my parents dismissed. She had died when I was 16, and I had always been told she left behind modest educational funds for her grandchildren, money my parents had already used for tuition. What trust? I asked, my voice sharper than I intended. Perhaps we should meet in person, he said. This is a delicate matter. We arranged to meet the next day at a cafe near Washington Square Park, neutral ground where I could leave if anything felt wrong. That night I barely slept, my mind racing with possibilities. What could he tell me that was urgent enough to risk my father's wrath? When I arrived at the cafe, I chose a corner table where I could see both the entrance and the exit. Old habits of self-preservation had taken root in me quickly. A few minutes later, Charles walked in. He looked older than I remembered, his suit slightly rumpled, his face lined with exhaustion. This was not the polished attorney I grew up seeing. This was a man carrying a burden. Thank you for meeting me, Isabella, he said as he slid into the seat across from me. His voice was softer than I expected. Just tell me why I'm here, I said, wrapping my hands around my coffee cup to steady them. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Your grandmother established a substantial trust in your name before she died. It was separate from the education funds. Very specific conditions were outlined. You were to gain access either when you turned 30 or upon completing graduate school, whichever came first. The words sank in slowly, like stones dropping into water. That can't be right. My father told me the trust was used up for college. Charles shook his head. That was never true. The trust was never meant for your parents to control permanently. It was designated for you alone. They were named temporary administrators until you fulfilled the conditions. And since you passed the bar exam, the condition has been met. I stared at him, trying to process. How much? He hesitated, then took a deep breath. Approximately $2.5 million. Invested well. It has grown. The world tilted around me. I gripped the edge of the table, trying to anchor myself. $2.5 million. And my parents never told me? His eyes flicked downward, shame in his expression. They used the assets as collateral for business ventures. Technically, the funds remain intact, but the way they leveraged it was a clear violation of their fiduciary duty. I warned your father, but he insisted he could reinterpret the trust's language. When I reviewed the documents again last week, after he ordered your removal from certain holdings, I realized how deep the irregularities went. I can no longer ignore it. Anger flared through me, hot and sharp. My parents had disowned me, stripped me of everything, and yet all this time they had been using money that was legally mine. So why are you telling me now? You've been their lawyer for years. Because if you go to another attorney, you will sue them. And you will win. I am trying to resolve this before it escalates. They know they've been caught. They are panicking. They want a meeting tomorrow at my office. I laughed bitterly. Now they want to talk? After cutting me off and throwing me out like garbage? He held my gaze steadily. Isabella, you have leverage now. For the first time in your life, the power is yours. As if on cue, my phone buzzed on the table. It was a text from my mother, the first since that dinner. Darling, we need to talk. Your father said things he didn't mean. Family is everything. Please come home. I stared at the message, my chest tightening. My parents had erased me, and now, suddenly, they were reaching out. But I knew the truth. It wasn't love driving this. It was fear. For the first time in weeks, I felt a strange sense of calm. I wasn't powerless anymore. My grandmother had seen this coming, had left me not only money but a lifeline, a way to break free. My parents had built walls around me my entire life, but now I had the key. As I walked out of the cafe into the bustling streets of Manhattan, I knew the next step would change everything. Tomorrow's meeting wasn't just about money. It was about rewriting the rules of what it meant to be a Harrington. And I was ready to face them. The morning of the meeting with my parents arrived heavy with anticipation. I barely slept the night before, lying awake on Jasmine's couch, staring at the cracked ceiling as every possible outcome played out in my mind. I imagined my father's rage, my mother's cutting remarks, the inevitable manipulation cloaked in concern. Yet beneath the anxiety, there was a flicker of something else. For the first time in my life, I wasn't walking into a room defenseless. I had the truth, I had the law, and I had someone by my side who knew how to fight. Her name was Susan Lee, a sharp, unflinching trust litigator recommended by one of my professors. When I told her my story, she didn't hesitate. She took the case with a mixture of outrage and determination, her eyes flashing with the kind of fire that only comes from facing injustice too many times. We're not going in there looking for a fight, she told me firmly as we prepared, but we will be ready if they start one. You hold the leverage, do not forget that. I clung to her words as we rode the elevator up to Charles Whitman's office in Midtown. The building was one I had visited countless times as a child, trailing after my father in patent leather shoes, told to sit quietly and absorb how real business was conducted. The marble lobby gleamed, the elevator chimed softly, and for a moment, I was 10 years old again, small and invisible. But then I caught my reflection in the polished steel doors. This time, I wasn't a child. I was an attorney. And I wasn't here to observe. I was here to fight. The receptionist looked startled when I gave my name. Her eyes flicked to Susan, then quickly away, as though she sensed this meeting would not be like the others. She directed us to the conference room, her voice slightly too cheerful, betraying her nerves. Inside, my parents were already seated on one side of the massive table. My father looked impeccable, his navy suit tailored to perfection, his cufflinks gleaming. But I noticed the tension in his jaw, the way his fingers tapped once against the table before he stilled them. My mother wore a pale silk blouse, her pearls shining against her throat, her expression carefully arranged into maternal concern. Edward sat beside them, his posture stiff, while Samantha perched elegantly at his side, her eyes darting between all of us like a guest at a play she hadn't rehearsed for. Charles sat at the head of the table, folders neatly arranged before him, his face drawn with discomfort. He glanced at me, then at Susan, and gave the smallest nod of encouragement. "Isabella," my mother said, rising as if to embrace me. Her voice dripped with practiced warmth. "We're so relieved you agreed to meet. Who is this with you?" I stepped back from her approach. "This is Susan Lee, my attorney." The mask slipped for just a fraction of a second before she smoothed it back into place. My father's expression darkened. "There's no need for outside counsel," he said, his voice clipped. "This is a family matter." I met his gaze evenly. "You made it clear I am not family anymore. Susan stays." Susan settled beside me, her presence steadying. Charles cleared his throat. "Now that we're all here, let's review the situation." The trust established by Margaret Harrington for her granddaughter Isabella specified distribution upon completion of graduate education. That condition has been met. The trust, currently valued at approximately $2.3 million, should be transferred to Isabella's control immediately. My father leaned forward, his smile ablaze. "Before we proceed with any transfers, I think we can all agree that family unity is paramount. Isabella, your mother and I have discussed the unfortunate events of last week, and we're willing to put it behind us. You belong with us. But we need to ensure the Harrington legacy remains secure." He nodded to Charles, who slid a document across the table. I recognized it instantly. A trust transfer agreement, but with modifications. Susan picked it up, scanning quickly. Her brows arched. This document would transfer control of the trust assets to Harrington Real Estate. My client would receive only a small annual distribution, effectively forfeiting any real control. In other words, she would be handing her inheritance back to you. My father steepled his fingers, his voice smooth. "It provides financial security while keeping the family aligned. It's the logical choice." I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest. For years, I had fought to be seen as more than a liability, more than a disappointment. And here they were again, trying to strip away the one thing my grandmother had left me. "No," I said simply, pushing the document back across the table. The words seemed to hang in the air, louder than a shout. My father's eyes narrowed, his face flushing with color. "I don't think you understand what's being offered here." "I understand perfectly," I replied, my voice steadier than I felt. "You disowned me, you cut me off, left me with nothing. And now, because you've been caught misusing money that doesn't belong to you, you expect me to hand it back? That's not family, that's manipulation." My mother's voice slid in, soft and persuasive. "Darling, your father spoke in anger. He didn't mean those things. Of course, you're still our daughter. We just want what's best for you." Susan spoke before I could. "What's best for her is to assume full control of her trust as stipulated by law. And I will require full documentation of all transactions involving trust assets for the past 12 years. My father's veneer of civility cracked. His voice rose, thunderous now. "Without us, you are nothing. Our name opens doors. Our connections build careers. If you insist on this adversarial path, I can ensure you never work in this city again. One word from me, and that little legal aid position you're so proud of will vanish." A chill swept through me, but instead of shrinking, I straightened. Is that a threat? Because if it is, I will make sure the courts and the Bar Association know exactly how far you're willing to go to silence me. For the first time, I saw something flicker across his face. Not anger, fear. At that moment, the door opened and Clara slipped in, her eyes wide as they darted around the room. She had heard. Edward shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight, as though rehearsing the words he would use to smooth things over later. But Clara looked at me with something else, something closer to recognition. My father slammed his hand on the table. Enough. Either you sign the agreement and return to the family on our terms, or you walk away with nothing. Your choice. I rose from my chair, my heart pounding, my voice low but unshaking. I choose me. I choose the life Grandma Margaret wanted me to have. I choose freedom. I choose freedom. The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the sound of Susan gathering her papers. My father's face was a mask of fury, my mother's eyes glassy with unshed tears she would never let fall. Edward looked down at the table, while Clara's gaze lingered on mine, a flicker of something like solidarity passing between us. As Susan and I walked out of the conference room, my legs trembled, but my chest felt lighter than it had in years. For once, I had faced them on my own terms. For once, I had refused to yield. But I knew this was only the beginning. Taking control of the trust was one battle. Building a life beyond the Harrington name would be the war that followed. And as the elevator doors closed behind us, I understood that my fight was far from over. The first thing I did after securing control of my trust was nothing. That surprised me. You would think that after weeks of scraping by on Jasmine's couch, after pawning my grandmother's necklace just to buy groceries, I would have been desperate to spend. But instead of indulging in the luxuries my parents had raised me to believe were necessities, I felt a kind of stillness. For the first time, I wasn't afraid of running out of money. I wasn't afraid of eviction notices or declined credit cards. And in that calm, I realized I had no interest in returning to the life I once had. Instead of searching for penthouses with doormen or apartments near Central Park, I looked in Brooklyn. I wanted someplace far from the gleaming skyline that had become a cage. When I found a one-bedroom walk-up in Brooklyn Heights, I knew it was mine before I even stepped inside. The floors creaked, the kitchen appliances looked decades old, and the view was nothing more than the brick wall of the neighboring building. But it was mine. Paid for in full with a portion of my trust, it belonged entirely to me, with no strings attached. The first night I slept there, on a mattress still wrapped in plastic, I felt something I had never experienced in the Harrington penthouse or my sleek Cambridge apartment. Peace. The silence wasn't suffocating. It was comforting. I lay in the dark and thought about the life ahead of me. I didn't need crystal chandeliers or mahogany tables. I needed purpose. When my official position began at the Legal Aid Society of New York, I stepped into a world that could not have been further from the manicured halls of my family's empire. The office was crowded, paper stacked in corners, the carpet worn thin, but the energy was electric. My colleagues carried themselves with a quiet fierceness, the kind of people who stayed long after the lights went out, not because it paid well, but because it mattered. My first cases were small by any traditional measure, but monumental to the people I represented. I defended a single mother facing eviction after her landlord claimed she had violated her lease by complaining about broken heat in the dead of winter. I helped a domestic violence survivor secure a protection order, standing by her side as she shook in the courtroom, whispering that she wasn't alone. Each client carried the weight of battles my family would have dismissed as trivial, but to them, and to me, they were everything. The work was exhausting. I came home most nights drained, collapsing on my thrift store couch, surrounded by mismatched furniture I had chosen myself. But it was the kind of exhaustion that came with meaning. For the first time, I wasn't living someone else's story. I was writing my own. One evening, as I sat at my tiny kitchen table drafting motions, I found myself staring at the receipt from the pawn shop where I had left my grandmother's necklace. 90 days. That was the window they had given me to buy it back. I felt a sharp ache in my chest. Those pearls weren't just jewelry. They were her. They were the proof that someone in the Harrington family had believed in me, even when no one else did. The next morning, I walked back into that pawn shop and placed crisp bills on the counter. When the owner handed me the necklace, I held it in my hands and whispered a quiet promise. I would not let her faith in me be wasted. With her memory guiding me, I began planning something bigger than myself. I wanted to make sure that others who came from families like mine, where support was conditional and independence punished, had a lifeline. I used part of the trust to establish the Margaret Harrington Fellowship, a scholarship for law students pursuing public interest careers. I thought of the young woman I once was, terrified of choosing law over business, crushed under the weight of my parents' disappointment. I imagined what it would have meant to know that someone had paved a path for me. That was what I wanted to offer to others. The first fellow we awarded was a brilliant first-generation student who had once been homeless. When she came into my office to thank me, tears filled her eyes. "I thought I'd never be able to afford to do this work," she said. "Now I can." In that moment, I felt my grandmother's presence so strongly, it was as if she were standing beside me, smiling. Word of my work began to spread. Local papers covered one of my cases, where I successfully defended a group of tenants against a landlord notorious for illegal evictions in Queens. The tenants hugged me outside the courthouse, some of them crying, and I thought of my father's words at that dinner. He had called this work an embarrassment. But standing there on the courthouse steps, I had never felt prouder. When the New York Times Metro section ran a small feature on the case, my phone buzzed with a text from my mother. "We saw the article. Please be discreet in the future. Your father is concerned about the family image." Not a word of congratulations. No recognition of the lives I had helped save. Only concern for appearances. Reading her message, I realized with startling clarity that I no longer needed their approval. Their world was shrinking, while mine was expanding. But even as I built this new life, the shadows of my family never fully disappeared. Their names still followed me, whispered in courtrooms and murmured in hushed conversations at galas I now attended on behalf of legal aid organizations. And though I had chosen a modest apartment, a modest salary, and a modest way of living, my family's wealth and power still cast a long shadow. I knew that sooner or later, they would step back into my life. And when they did, I would have to face them again, not as the girl desperate for their approval, but as the woman who had built something greater than they could ever understand. That moment arrived sooner than I expected, when a familiar invitation appeared in my mailbox, written in my mother's elegant script, summoning me back into the world I had left behind. And this time, I had to decide whether to walk through that door, or close it forever. The envelope sat on my kitchen counter for 2 full days before I opened it. Heavy cardstock, my mother's elegant cursive across the front, sealed with the Harrington crest. I didn't need to read it to know what it was. For as long as I could remember, the Harrington Easter brunch had been one of our most elaborate family traditions. A display of wealth disguised as faith, where the food was catered, the flowers imported, and the guest list curated from the upper echelons of New York society. I had assumed I was permanently erased from those gatherings. Yet here was an invitation addressed to me, the prodigal daughter, as though nothing had happened. When I finally broke the seal, the message inside was short. Family should be together for the holidays. The words were simple, but I could hear my mother's voice in them, polished and persuasive, as if she could rewrite history with a turn of phrase. I carried the card to my tiny kitchen table, sat down, and stared at it. My instinct screamed it wasn't about reconciliation, it was about optics. My father needed to project strength and unity after the trust scandal. Having me at the table would signal to their world that the Harrington family was unbroken. They wanted me as a prop, not a daughter. Jasmine found me still sitting there when she came home that evening. "You look like you've seen a ghost," she said, setting down her grocery bags. I slid the card across the table. She read it, then looked at me carefully. "Are you going to go?" I didn't answer right away. Part of me longed to walk into that penthouse and show them what they had lost. To sit at their glittering table, not as the girl who begged for scraps of their approval, but as the woman who had built a life without them. But another part of me recoiled at the thought of being back under that chandelier, playing my part in their theater of perfection. I don't know, I finally whispered. That night, I lay awake replaying old memories. Easter mornings in matching pastel outfits, my mother arranging us on the grand staircase for photos. My father leading a toast in front of business associates, his words dripping with pride for Edward, for Clara, for the family empire. My own name rarely mentioned. And then the last dinner, the night he disowned me. The slam of the door still echoing in my chest. Could I really step back into that room and pretend it never happened? In the end, I sent a brief reply. Thank you for the invitation, but I won't be attending. The moment I pressed send, I felt both relief and grief. I wasn't ready. Instead, I spent Easter Sunday volunteering at a community meal program in Brooklyn. The room was crowded, the tables mismatched, the food simple but warm. I ladled soup into bowls beside Jasmine, and laughed with strangers who treated me with more kindness than my own family ever had. When one of the organizers raised a toast to community, I realized that this was family too. Not bound by blood or reputation, but by choice. By care freely given. But my family was never far away. 2 weeks later, I was wandering through a farmer's market when I nearly collided with my mother. She was dressed impeccably as always, heels clicking against the pavement, her designer bag slung over her arm. My father stood beside her, looking tired, older than I remembered, his eyes shadowed with something I couldn't quite name. For a moment we simply stared at each other, three people bound by blood but separated by chasms of silence. My mother recovered first. Isabella, she said with a smile too tight. What a surprise. I live here, I said evenly, lifting my canvas bag filled with local produce. What brings you to Brooklyn? My father cleared his throat. Doctor's orders. Something about organic food. The words were clipped, but I noticed the tremor in his hand as he adjusted his sleeve. Before the awkwardness could thicken, a small child ran past, bumping into my mother and sending her a step back into a puddle. Her pristine shoes were ruined, the leather darkened with water. I braced myself for her outburst, the familiar sharp words about carelessness and ruin. But instead, my father reached out, steadying her arm. His expression, for once, was not anger but concern. Are you all right? He asked softly. The sight unsettled me more than any of his fury ever had. My father showing tenderness was like watching a stone crack. Perhaps we could get some coffee, my mother said after a moment, gesturing toward a small cafe at the edge of the market. Her voice was unusually tentative. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We sat at a corner table, a scene so far removed from our usual meetings it felt almost surreal. The conversation started with safe topics: the weather, Edward's latest deal, Clara's new gallery project. My father studied me carefully, assessing, calculating. Finally, he said, "You seem well." Coming from him, it was almost a compliment. "I am well," I replied. "My work is meaningful. My life is my own." My mother set down her cup with a faint clink. "We saw the article about your case. The reporter made you sound very effective." "I help people who need it," I said simply. "That's all I've ever wanted to do." Silence stretched between us. I could feel them waiting, hoping I might offer an opening, some sign of willingness to slide back into their orbit. But I wasn't that girl anymore. "I've learned something this past year," I said quietly. "About family. About what it should be. Acceptance without conditions. Support without control. Love without agenda." My father scoffed, but his voice lacked conviction. "Idealistic." "Maybe," I said. "But it's what I needed. And I never received it from you." For a moment, my mother's face softened, a flicker of regret passing through her eyes before she looked away. My father remained rigid, though his silence spoke louder than his protests. When I stood to leave, I added, "My door is open, if you ever want to know me, the real me, not the daughter who failed to follow your plan." I turned toward the exit, but then my father's voice stopped me. "Your grandmother would be proud." The words froze me mid-step. I turned back, searching his face for sarcasm, for manipulation. Instead, I found only weariness, and perhaps the faintest glimmer of respect. I left the cafe with my heart pounding. For the first time, a fault line had opened in the unshakable Harrington facade, and I knew that crack, however small, would change everything. What I didn't know was how quickly it would widen, pulling us all toward a reckoning none of us could avoid. The first time I saw my parents again after the cafe encounter was at a gala I had never expected to attend. It was a fundraiser for legal aid organizations across New York, an event meant to shine a light on the kind of work that had become my entire life. Normally, junior staff attorneys like me didn't make the guest list. But a recent case I had won against a notorious landlord had attracted attention. The organizers wanted me there as a symbol, a reminder of why the fight mattered. I spent hours debating what to wear, finally settling on a simple black dress I had bought secondhand, tailored to fit me perfectly. I paired it with my grandmother's pearl necklace, the one I had bought back from the pawn shop, with shaking hands. As I fastened it around my neck, I felt her with me, steadying me. It was not about glamour anymore. It was about carrying her strength into the room with me. The ballroom was filled with faces I didn't recognize. Judges, lawyers from top firms, activists, journalists. The hum of conversation was electric, punctuated by bursts of laughter and the clinking of glasses. I was in the middle of a conversation with a young attorney from another nonprofit when I felt it, that prickle along my spine, the unmistakable awareness of eyes watching me. I turned, and there they were. My parents, gliding through the crowd as if the room belonged to them. My mother, immaculate in navy silk, her pearls gleaming under the chandeliers. My father in his signature tailored suit, shoulders squared, every step radiating control. For a heartbeat, I froze. My throat tightened, my chest ached, and I thought about slipping away into the crowd. But then I caught sight of my reflection in the mirrored wall. The pearls, the dress, the woman I had become. Running was no longer who I was, so I stood my ground. My mother reached me first, her air kiss brushing my cheek with practiced ease, as though nothing had ever fractured between us. "Isabella," she said, her smile brittle. "How lovely to see you here." My father followed, his nod curt. "You're looking well." "I am," I replied evenly. "My work is fulfilling." There was no mistaking the tension. My mother's eyes flicked around the room, calculating who might be watching, how the scene appeared to others. My father's jaw tightened as though he was holding back words that might crack the facade. For a moment, we stood there in a stalemate of politeness, a family tableau carefully posed. Then the young attorney I had been speaking with earlier returned, excitement bright on his face. "Are you Isabella Harrington? I just wanted to say your strategy in the Riverview Apartments case was brilliant. We're actually using parts of it in our litigation in Queens." His admiration was genuine, his voice carrying enough to be overheard by those nearby. The contrast was stark. In his eyes, I was not a disappointment. I was an example. My father's expression soured, his lips pressing into a thin line. My mother's smile faltered, unease flickering beneath her mask. I realized, in that moment, they were witnessing something they couldn't control. Me being recognized for who I was, not for the family I came from. As the attorney excused himself, my father leaned closer, his voice low and sharp. "You should be careful. Antagonizing the real estate community could backfire. They have long memories." "I'm not antagonizing anyone," I said, my voice steady. "I'm representing people who deserve justice. That's all that matters to me." He shook his head, disappointment etched across his face. "You always did miss the bigger picture." "Actually," I countered, "I think I finally see it clearly." Before the conversation could deepen, a judge I had met earlier approached, greeting me warmly. My parents stepped back, stiff smiles plastered on their faces as they were forced to watch me move seamlessly in a space they believed I could never belong. Later that evening, as the gala drew to a close, I found myself near the balcony overlooking the city. The skyline glittered, familiar and distant. I thought I was alone until I heard footsteps behind me. It was my father. For a moment, we stood in silence, the city stretching before us. Then he spoke, his voice low, almost weary. The family business is struggling. Without the leverage of certain assets, we've had to scale back. Edward is doing his best, but... He trailed off, as though the admission itself was dangerous. Then he turned to me. We could use your cooperation. It was not an apology. It was not even acknowledgement of the wrong they had done. It was a plea wrapped in pride, a request disguised as strategy. My heart twisted with conflicting emotions. Part of me wanted to say yes, to finally be wanted, even if for the wrong reasons. But another part, the stronger part, knew the truth. I'm sorry to hear that, I said sincerely. But my trust isn't a family resource. It was my grandmother's gift to me, not to Harrington Real Estate. His expression hardened, the moment of vulnerability shuddered away. You truly have turned your back on everything we built for you. No, I replied quietly. I've simply built something new for myself. Something I know Grandma Margaret would be proud of. The silence that followed was heavier than any argument we had ever had. My father straightened his shoulders, his mask slipping back into place, and without another word, he walked back inside. I stayed on the balcony, the city lights blurring as tears filled my eyes. Not of sadness, but of release. I had faced him, not as the desperate daughter, but as the woman I had become. For the first time, I knew I no longer needed their approval. But I also knew this was far from over. Families like mine did not let go easily. They would find another way to draw me back, another angle to press. The next move was theirs, and I had to be ready. I didn't realize how soon it would come, or how much it would force me to decide once and for all what family truly meant. 1 year after the night my father disowned me, I stood in my small Brooklyn apartment, sunlight streaming through the crooked blinds, and felt something I had never felt in the Harrington penthouse: peace. My life was no longer gilded, no longer choreographed to impress a social circle that valued appearances over substance. It was messy, modest, and mine. I had spent the year building more than just a new home or a new career. I had built a new understanding of what family truly means. I used to think family was something fixed, determined by bloodlines and legacy. But being cast out showed me the truth. Family is not just the people you are born to. Family is the people who see you, who accept you as you are, who stand beside you even when there is nothing to gain. For me, that family became friends like Jasmine, who opened her home when I had nowhere else to go, who reminded me that love is measured not in money, but in generosity. It became colleagues at Legal Aid, who fought every day with fierce hearts for strangers in need, and who celebrated victories that would never make the headlines but changed lives in quiet, profound ways. It became clients too, who trusted me with their stories, who let me carry their battles into courtrooms and showed me resilience stronger than any fortune could buy. In time, I realized my grandmother Margaret had known this all along. She had seen the cracks in the Harrington Foundation and created a lifeline for me, not just in money, but in faith. Her trust fund was not simply an inheritance, it was a message across time. Be who you are, even if it costs you everything. She had given me freedom long before I knew how much I would need it. The lesson I carry now is simple, but it took me a lifetime to learn. True freedom is not about cutting ties or burning bridges. It is about refusing to shrink yourself to fit into spaces that were never meant for you. It is about creating a life that reflects your values, even when it means walking away from the people who taught you to betray them. It is about knowing that worth is not measured by approval but by authenticity. If you take anything from my story, let it be this. You have the right to choose your family. You have the right to surround yourself with people who see your light instead of trying to dim it. And if you ever find yourself at the crossroads between being true to yourself or meeting someone else's expectations, remember that every step you take toward your truth is a step toward real freedom. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If my story resonated with you, please like this video, share it with someone who might need to hear it, subscribe for more, and leave a comment with your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose between the life your family wanted for you and the life you knew was meant for you? What did you decide, and how did it shape who you are today?